back to Book Talk with the Daughters of St. Paul. I'm Jeanette de Beauvoir.
And I'm Sister Catherine James.
And we are continuing to talk about Christ in our midst. It is curated as part of our Classic Wisdom collection here at Online Books and Media. And it's wisdom from Carol Houselander. And as we saw last time, Carol Houselander is not your typical mystic. And I really do want to start out talking about her mysticism, because most people who have mystical experiences experience Jesus speaking to them, and she sees Jesus speaking to her through other people, which is a very different kind of mysticism. And I just want to read one section of it on mystical relationships, because I think this is really telling. I remember one day asking an old man outside St. Paul's Cathedral, where I spent my hungry lunch hour, to give me a piece of the bread with which he was feeding the pigeons. He refused because, he said, he loved birds, not people. This answer puzzled me. My own attitude to people had radically changed since I had seen the Russian icon, and since the necessity of earning my living had forced me to go out and meet all kinds of people. I was still tormented by morbid shyness and a distressing consciousness of being peculiar myself. But in spite of that, people, those I knew and those I did not, fascinated me in an extraordinary, even an obsessive way. I felt that somehow, in some way not yet close to me, there must be a kind of mystical relationship between people, a bond which was wholly independent of exterior things, a kind of relationship which enabled all to help all, even though they were not acquainted. This, like so much else in my life, came to me through odd flashes and intuitions. It was not a thought out thing at all. Every night at about 10 o'clock, when I was sitting huddled on my bed in the dark, I heard the tap, tap, tap of a blind man's stick passing below in the street. It had an extraordinary effect on me. Somehow, between me and this unknown blind man, there was an affinity. Was I not spiritually blind? Was I not too tapping here, there, and everywhere, longing for light, but feeling my way in darkness? Because the darkness was not in the night that was lit by the splendor of the stars, but in my own soul. I began to pray for this blind man, and I had almost lost the habit of prayer. And that to me is capturing how Jesus just spoke to her and worked through people. And how, if we could capture that, imagine how our lives would be transformed and how the whole world would be different if we could hear that tap, tap, tap and realize how close we are to each other and how we're all looking for that.
I love the way she said it came to her in flashes of intuition, not something thought out.
Exactly.
But all of us have flashes of intuition. Exactly. She paid attention to them.
Well, that's exactly what Frederick Buechner says, actually. And in one of his books, he's talking about we're all more mystics than we think. What we do is we catch glimpses of what the saints were blinded by. And that's the same sort of thing. We get these flashes, we get these glimpses. And if we could enter more into them, we would be more like.
And I think that story of the blind man is a good example, because she allowed a sound that she heard that told her about a blind man, but she allowed herself to kind of question herself, like, where is my blindness? Where am I longing for light? And that almost developed meditation, just went deeper and deeper inside of her. But we all have those opportunities in life. We could be in a car on a highway and everybody's whizzing by me. What do I feel about that? You know, how is that a symbol, in a sense, of what life is all about, or what my spiritual life is all about? In these little tiny moments, God really allows us to mystically see ourselves, in a sense.
And to me, that's really the magic, if I can use that word, of Carol Houselander, because she's able to capture these things. What I also liked in that passage where she's talking about she didn't have enough to eat. She was financially strapped. She was in this room. She was making a living for herself. And many of us who have been in that position where we're worried about finances, it's easy then to say, I'll deal with the other stuff later. You know, I'm sorry, God, but right now I need to worry about paying the rent. I need to worry about this, that, and the other thing, because one feels so alone in those moments. And she's able to turn that around and say, yeah, I was puzzled by that response to me, because it wasn't what I expected when I asked him for bread. And to take that and to say, all right, that helps me understand others, instead of dwelling on the fact that, you know, I get up in the morning, I take the subway to work, I don't have enough money, this is frightening, all that sort of thing, which many people live through.
Right. And the busyness of that passage, I think, is really important, because sometimes you might feel, even in the convent, you know, I don't have enough time to pray.
Right.
I don't have enough time to do everything I want to do to become holy. And I'm raising my children. I have 2 jobs, and I'm taking care of my parents, whatever it is. But for her, it wasn't a matter of disappearing out of life into some other sacred experience that was necessary. It was realizing the sacredness in the everyday experience of life that actually transformed her through these flashes of intuition. St. Paul tells us that we need to be transformed by the renewal of our mind. So instead of thinking like, well, how dare he say that? That's stupid, and I'm hungry, and I know I hate the world, or whatever. It was a renewal of her mind, that, or using her mind really in the way it was meant to be used, that allowed even those experiences to become sacred experiences for her.
Right. As we said last time when we were talking about the subway being a sacred space, that all of this is. And what I love is that when she had visions, yes, she did have the major one of the Russian icon in the sky, but other than that, all of her visions came to her through people. And it was just all about their suffering in some ways, that she suffered with them. That I think you wanted to talk about.
I think sometimes when we think of vocation, we can say, God has a plan for my life, and that plan is that I become a sister or a married person, or I do this or I do that. And for her, you don't hear any of that in her writing. You know, there's no big plan that she needs to do or to find or discover. Instead, she had this really strong sense that no matter what life brought her, it was part of this design of God. Not that God planned for life to be hard, but God somehow could take that up into his designs.
And it worked through everything for her. It worked through the fact that she was able to counsel people during the Second World War. It worked through all of her writings. She was also a sculptor and an artist, and she really brought forth these beautiful things out of nothing. And all of it just because she was open to God speaking through all of the people around her.
And when we're speaking of vocation, then she really went back to the basic question that we all have to face in our life: for what purpose do I exist? Because each one of us, she says, is the material which Christ himself has fashioned for his purpose. None of us is here by accident. None of us is here with no purpose. We each have a purpose. And so our vocation, our mysticism, is really encapsulated in that very simple question: for what purpose do I exist? How is God using me in his plans, in his purpose?
And she found that in everyday occurrences. It wasn't like, oh, there's this one huge grand plan that I have to fulfill. It was every day I get up and I fulfill God's plan for me.
Now we're talking about her in terms of mysticism. So we can get the idea that she just, you know, there was a conversion in her early years and she fell away and she came back, and then it was smooth sailing straight on. And I love this passage from A Rocking Horse Catholic, when she basically says you know, I had failed to accept my own humiliation. I resented that others had more than I did. I tried to drag
Very
people
human.
down to my level.
Very human.
I set myself against the rich. I called them the idle classes. I became anti-clerical, and I disliked all hierarchy. So this is a very strong woman here.
Mhm.
But it was that vision of the icon of Jesus crowned as king, connected with the Tsar and his
Right.
death. It was that in a twinkling of an eye changed all that for her, because she suddenly saw the drama
Mhm.
of the reality of authority, of kingship, of Christ
Right.
in kings, as well as Christ in that sister we spoke about,
Right.
the Bavarian nun who is wearing a very different crown,
Right.
the crown of thorns. And so the crown of thorns is the crown of glory, and the crown of glory is also the crown of royalty, is also the crown
Right.
of thorns.
Because Russian iconography, as Catholics, we're used to seeing Christ crucified on the cross, but the Russian crosses are Christ crowned and in glory. And she probably hadn't seen that before she saw that icon and had not considered the idea of Christ as a king. So I'm sure that was part of what sort of made her rethink some of that. But I do love what you just read. I love that humanity of, I resented people who had more than I did, and I thought, you know, they weren't worthwhile. And because who hasn't had those feelings once in a while? Who hasn't had those thoughts? And to me,
they're part of the journey. They're
yes,
part of life.
So you shouldn't say to yourself, "Oh, you're a terrible person," because you just thought that. That's just part of it.
And so that flash of intuition, that mystical moment, it's not that she convinced herself otherwise.
Right.
She opened up the catechism and said, "Oh, I'm not supposed to think those things," or
right.
"Shame on me for being whatever." It was a gift of God that just changed it in an instant. And if we are aware, like her, of these moments when Jesus does that for us, then all these struggles that we have within ourselves in an instant are changed by him.
He changes everything. I want to read a little bit more about her mysticism is just what enchants me, because it's a very particular way of being with God. And this came somewhat after that story about being in her room and listening to the blind man and realizing that she too is blind in many ways. She said, "I began to feel an urge to go out and walk about at night among the London crowds. Until now, my interest had been in two sorts of people, those whom I actually knew personally, and the far-off Russians of whom I was always conscious as people living through the passion in our own days." And we have to remember that in London at that time that she's writing, which is right after right at the time of the Russian Revolution and after the Russian Revolution, this was a major political upheaval in people's lives. Now, curious as it may seem, because of this blind man, whom I had never seen, tapping with his stick in the night, I wanted to go out and rub shoulders with the London crowds. In some sort of way, which I could not yet define, I wanted to take part in those countless lives that I began to realize as pressing on me. And just this sense of this having opened her up made her want to be even more with people on those crowded subways and those crowded streets, and to experience them, because she was seeing Christ in every single face she saw.
And that I'm thinking, if she had lived during times of social media,
or
the TV news, or newspapers, or the Twitter, getting all your news on Twitter, imagine how she would have been totally taken even more. She wouldn't have had to go out on the London streets at night. It would have been right in her hands. And for us who struggle with what is the place of social media in our lives and how it's distracting us and disturbing us, this is just a wonderful mystical way of allowing ourselves, when we see something happening in the world, to say Christ is suffering in those people, and pray for them.
Because we say
unite
social
ourselves to
media,
them.
but we forget that behind everything is a person.
Mhm.
Social media is there because people are communicating, and these are people who we could see Christ in if we tried.
Yeah, that's so profound. So one other thought that I read that I was really moved by is, again, speaking off of social media and the news, she wrote, if we judge by the newspapers, Christianity is a failure.
Right.
You know, we
I
can
remember
look
that
at
part, yeah.
the social media, we can look at what's happening in the world, and we can say, really?
We're going to
So
heck
what
in a
happened?
handbasket.
What
Yes.
happened here?
Mhm.
Famine, cruelty, suspicion, threats, fear, violence, crime. After 2,000 years of missionaries preaching about Christianity, people living Christianity, and that's all we have. It certainly looks like a failure. The Christ, who claimed to be the light of the world, the life of the world, was dead. He had promised people a kingdom, and he had been hanged outside of the city. Only a handful of his followers were around, and they even denied they even knew him. He was stripped naked, made mock of. He died with nothing of his own, and even his grave was borrowed. Certainly, it looks like Christ was a failure. And I love this because it is so true when we look at our churches. At that time, she says, the faith of the whole world was kept alive by a few devoted women. And even the apostles doubted them when they told them what they should have known, that Christ had kept his word. Quote, but to their minds, the story seemed madness and they could not believe it. Those women believed it because they had the faith which discovers through love. I think that's like the key of our mysticism. It discovers not through what's happening, how does it affect me? It discovers through love.
Yeah.
They had never wanted any earthly triumph for Christ. They had never expected it. They believed in Christ, the poor man, the forsaken man, and even the crucified man. If they could not have Christ with all his humiliations and stripes, they would not seek to comfort themselves with anything else. So they came asking who would roll back the stone, to find it had already been removed and Christ alive, with the wounds our sin had inflicted on him, blazing like stars in his risen body. Isn't that magnificent?
It's beautiful.
And today, she says, it is in the Catholic Church that faith in the resurrection is kept alive. We can't take away, and we're meant to take away the cross, the pain. Christ, the poor man, still alive today. But we believe in the resurrection. And often enough, it is some pious old woman who is the keeper of the church's faith. Faith that is nourished by intimate personal love for the suffering Christ, the very tender love that seeks for Christ crucified in man. Isn't that amazing?
That is amazing. And it does bring us back to, I think, one of the reasons that she came back to the church and that she stayed Catholic and that we stay Catholic, which is that the church gets that you know, that he was crucified in essentially a garbage heap, and that none of this seems kingly. None of this seems like, if you were inventing a religion, this isn't the one you would invent.
Right.
And she gets that, and she says, you know, the church has this tremendous secret, but it's not a secret that's closed. It's a secret that's open to everybody if they want it. And what I like is she says, today the glory is still secret, but it's a secret communicated to millions through the simplest substances of life and the hourly practice of love. Resurrection is in the hearts of those who love, the heart of Christ beginning to beat in them. And once again, it comes back to her being able to look at anyone, and see Christ in them.
And just before that quote, she talks about the church being not only the hierarchy, but all the people. Sinners, saints, foolish, weak, young, mature, old, children, rich, poor, strong, and weak. All of us. And I love this. This is so cute. The secret is Christ risen lives in us. And then she says, Certainly, he has continued his policy of not letting his identity be obvious.
Right. It reminds me of a novel I read in which a reporter was asking a nun, weren't you surprised that God called you? And she said, yes, but not as surprised as I was that he called some of the others. this sense of, we're human, we are all human, and we err and we search and we do all these things, and this is all part of life in the church and life in Christ. And if we can see that in each other, then we're actually probably, I think, a lot happier than we're going around miserable and judging other people.
Yeah, it's just so amazing. It reminds me a lot of Eddie Hillesum, the book, An Interrupted Life. Again, lived through tremendous suffering, but through that whole process, began to really see Jesus in everyone, and really to serve at the cost of her own life. Serve Jesus in others, her brother and sister Jews. And at the very end, when the train, she went to the concentration camps in the end, when it left, I guess, from Westport, I think, to Auschwitz, they threw out a postcard that said, we left the camp singing, and it's just the same thing. She lived through really terrible times of the history of the last century, and we're living through terrible times in our own. And I want to read this over again, because it just helps us to think truly, not differently, but truly about what's going on and what our place is in it all. And we have a powerful place in the world today.
Right. It's absolutely great advice, I think, for any time. But I think you're right. I think often we despair of the times in which we live, that it can't get any worse. Well, of course it can, but we feel like, oh, I'm living a terrible time. We've lost the faith. The world is turning away from God. And the world has gone through many phases since the resurrection, and we're always renewed again and again. And she's certainly pointing to a way that we can be renewed. Again, we're talking about Christ in Our Midst by Carol Houselander. It's not a big volume. It's a collection of different works of hers. And if you're interested in pursuing it, it does quote which books they're coming from so that you can go and read some more about Carol Houselander, by Carol Houselander. But in the meantime, we definitely recommend Christ in Our Midst. Thank you for your time, sister.
Thank you. It's been a delight.
And thank you all for joining us. We'll see you here again next time on Book Talk, the Daughters of St. Paul.